The Super Nintendo library features a handful of games that push the system's capabilities far beyond the perceived boundaries that most of the developers worked within. The system's Mode 7 function enabled some games to go beyond anything that had been done previously, and create experiences that were unique to the platform. The ability to rotate large objects would allow developers to expand their platformer ideas, allowing for swinging platforms on the smaller scale, and entire gravity shifts if they were feeling experimental. One developer, led by a star programmer, would take advantage of the new features and push the console to the extreme. After the release of the first Bubsy game, Solid Software were awarded some freedom by Accolade and decided to make an attempt at a new, trendy mascot for themselves. And no other character is more appropriately late 90s than Mohawk. Sporting a Walkman, some sunglasses, and nothing else, Mohawk is condensed 90s energy as a character. Solid Software had algorithmically devised the perfect mascot for themselves, and would implement that character into a mathematically appropriate platforming game. So while there are a lot of heavily calculated factors involved in Mohawk and HeadphoneJack, and technological feats to be impressed by, does the game do anything more? Does Mohawk have something important to convey to the player? Or is there something about the level designs and themes that mimic Sonic the Hedgehog's environmentalist ideas? Was Mohawk and HeadphoneJack created to be something beside a tech demo or a Sonic copycat? And most importantly, is this game a secret Bubsy sequel? The footage for this video was recorded on stream. If you'd like notifications for when I go live, or just want to chat about games and videos, join the Discord in the description. Released in 1997, Mohawk and HeadphoneJack tells the story of the evil General Headslot's attack on Party Planet's music collection, and Mohawk's adventure to get the collection back. The CDs have been scattered throughout the planet's 7 layers, and the player must collect as many as they can, as well as battle a few of Headslot's henchmen to continue through the layers. Since the events are occurring beneath the planet's surface, the gravitational forces that Mohawk will experience are constantly changing, and the levels within the game reflect that by rotating around the character. This is where the game's infamous motion sickness generation comes from. The game engages somewhere in the region of 32 gravitation directions, and frequently utilizes as many as possible, including frantically shifting between them. The Super Nintendo's Mode 7 function was unmatched at the time, and most home PCs and the Mega Drive were not capable of replicating the unique aspects of this game. So while it is safe to say that there was nothing exactly like Mohawk and HeadphoneJack, the game does borrow heavily from its forebear. Bubsy Bobcat made his first appearance in 1993's Bubsy in Claws Encountered of the Third Kind, and the character has been marred by disinterest ever since. Bubsy's original adventure was Accolade's attempt at a mascot platformer of their own, hoping to capitalize on the popularity of Super Mario World and Sonic the Hedgehog. This first game emphasized collection and exploration, and would be among the many early collectathon-style platformers. This amounted to yet another entry to the mascot platformer pile, and Accolade were even stubborn enough to continue giving the go-ahead for more entries into the Bubsy franchise, ultimately resulting in the infamous Bubsy 3D in 1996. Meanwhile, those core attributes of Bubsy gameplay, the exploration and collection, were being expanded upon by one of Accolade's development partners. Mohawk and HeadphoneJack levels are split into 2 overarching objectives. The first is to collect a number of CDs that cause a portal to open to the next level, and the second is to defeat a boss. Traveling throughout the entire level is almost mandatory while collecting CDs, while the boss levels don't require more than defeating that enemy. Mohawk has a fairly high top speed, and the level can fly by if there aren't any obstacles in the path. This rarely occurs though, as every level is heavily populated by enemies that force the player to slow down in order to deal with them. Initially, I found this quite frustrating, as I wanted to zoom around the levels and avoid hazards instead of having to walk around hoping to avoid enemies. My opinion changed a bit on this as the game continued, but by about the 5th world my lenience had evaporated and I was just hoping the levels would open up for once. Mohawk has up to 5 health and 2 different attacks, a screen clear that requires ammo to use, and totally not Sonic Spin Dash. Strangely, this spiky ball form cannot be held indefinitely, so the player can't just roll around at the speed of sound, although there are many places to go and there is certainly a rainbow to follow. The ball attack also sits right in the middle of the game's attack hierarchy, so Mohawk can attack through some projectiles, but things like fire will always hit through the spikes. Mohawk also has 2 different types of jump, which might seem unnecessary at first, but that lower jump does come in quite handy throughout a lot of tight, perilous platforming sections. Landing on the edges of those platforms can be a pretty aggravating death sentence, so the player has to make sure safe movements at all times. There are also a number of power-ups to utilize while exploring a level, ranging from underwater breathing to flight. Flight is rather challenging within the gravitational changes, and can result in the worst screen flipping in the game. Levels in Mohawk and HeadphoneJack are gigantic, and often packed with smaller platforming challenges and extreme geography. Their sizes make finding one's way and remembering where one has been difficult, and the ease of getting lost is often exacerbated by the lack of effective landmarks and visual distinction. Flying through this big grey circular room could lead to having to complete multiple laps, and I did find that I was frequently having to do that. Sometimes the levels include lock and key scenarios too, and these would often be the least convenient they could be. I spent upwards of 40 minutes within one attempt at a level, because it required returning back to the same place 3 separate times, and I had a map. And whoever thought 7-2 was acceptable needs some form of therapy. What the hell? Most stages in the game contain a system of pipes that Mohawk can squeeze into to be slowly transported around. Some of these pipes are impossibly absurd. 2-1 contains 2 separate pipes that take more than a minute to finish. The player has to sit and watch Mohawk spinning around in these pipes for some unbelievable lengths of time. Some levels have very similar mechanics which just teleport Mohawk to the exit. I cannot understand any reason to do this deliberately. And if you didn't think it could be more tedious, 7-2, the final level in the game, uses the pipes as a maze. The map I found ran out of alphabetical labels for the entries and exits. It then ran out of single-digit number labels, and managed to get to AM in just pipe entrance and exit labels. That's 50 labels, excluding the 18 teleporter labels. And I had a map. What were kids supposed to do in 1997? And I didn't even go into the secret areas. Mode 7 allowed for some very unique functions, and became even more important with the implementation of the Super FX chip. But embracing new technology blindly doesn't always result in something valuable. While the inclusion of the background rotation is fascinating, a handful of accommodations would have gone a long way to make that spinning tolerable. Falling through a transition or entering a tight space with a flight power-up can cause a lot of the rotations to trigger in quick succession. And if it were possible to put a limit on the number of rotations that could occur in that time, I think that would have made those instances less disorientating and more bearable. Similarly, scripting transitions through environments would mean that the view of Mohawk would always be consistent, and it would make progressing through levels predictable and clear. Currently, the level design favors wide rooms with very little gravity implementation, or narrow halls filled with hazards and regular gravity changes. So scripting a camera within these layouts would likely do little to help the problem. But those scripted camera changes would offer some form of landmark for the player to use as a breadcrumb, because most of the worlds rarely feature much in the way of visual luxuries. I enjoy some janky visuals, and I'm always happy to look at pixel art, but they sure did pick some colors for this game. Mohawk and HeadphoneJack features some interesting palette choices. Most of the levels are grey with some accent colors, and I suppose this is thematically appropriate, although the themes are really hard to see if you don't know the names of the levels. The non-grey levels are brown or purple or... Oh no! This palette is a crime. Whatever artistic idea this is supposed to convey has been totally overshadowed by the sheer eyesore. I don't even see how this represents guts. That stereotypical 90s aesthetic never features palettes like this. Their design algorithm was way off. There is a strange secondary issue with the palettes in that the enemies of most levels will use the same colors. Camouflaging the enemies makes the exploration even slower, and Mohawk's high speed even less applicable. And those enemy designs are subpar. This game features a desolate selection of sprite sheet animation. Almost every enemy is a collection of rotating shapes, which makes them quite uninteresting to engage with, and very easy to forget. Unfortunately, the bosses aren't much better. There are 8 total bosses throughout the game, and while one is repeated, it has been altered significantly to seem like a new encounter. The Walker, the Tiki, the Octopus, the Orb, the Parasite, the Lava Surfer, and the Brain are all encountered within the second half of every world, while General Headslot is the final encounter and occurs immediately after defeating the Brain. I defeated the Orb and the Parasite on my first attempts. The Octopus didn't take much more than a handful, and every other boss was as challenging as the rest of the game. The Walker has a surprisingly wide range of attacks to throw at the player that can be fairly difficult to deal with when getting to grips with the controls. Somehow, when the player encounters General Headslot at the game's conclusion, this battle is still tough. I think quite positively of these encounters, although their visual spectacle is quite lacking. The Tiki and the Lava Surfer were the largest hurdles for me to cross, and I just wasn't able to enter the battles with a sufficient plan of attack or enough health to concoct one. It was possible to kind of aggress onto the Walker and win, so when the Tiki refused to be taken down by this strategy, I had to reassess my approach to combating the higher tier enemies. The Lava Surfer is more of an endurance test that gets kind of boring after a while. The player must dodge the dolphins before getting to take a swing at the boss, and then the boss leaves the safe area, so the player has to wait for them to come back. The Brain, the Orb, and the Parasite have very little in the way of dangerous attacks, so the player can often sit right on top of them and continually deal damage. Overall, I think the bosses are decent but not noteworthy. They almost never use the game's unique aspects within the fights, but they aren't disasters for it. The game overall is very much a disaster though. Ignoring the gravitation mechanic, the levels and the enemies are just lackluster. Shapeless, characterless blobs to run around and hope not to be killed by. And they will kill the player. Every time some flow arrives or some wacky geography appears, there'll be some hazard ahead to spoil the momentum. The defining mechanic is a great concept, but it hasn't been executed in a satisfactory way here. There's too much danger for the chaos to be truly enjoyable, which is especially disappointing for me, because this kind of wild shit is exactly my thing. If you were ever curious about how Super Mario Galaxy would work on the Super Nintendo, then it's worth playing the first level or two. For a casual playthrough, you'd have a better time with a lot of other games. In the end, Mohawk and HeadphoneJack has proven to be critically and artistically shallow, amounting to little more than a Bubsy spin-off with an AI-generated 90s themed skin stretched over it. Someone at Solid Software heard about Mode 7 and decided to pitch it as a game, without much consideration for any of the other factors that the game would include. Mohawk is just Sonic, but slightly more naked. The levels are just Sonic levels, without the flair. The player collects shapes, and a developer said that they could be CDs instead of balls of yarn, and that was the entire narrative development up until someone had to write the manual. There's very little to like about this game, but I'm happy I played it. I haven't been so excited to finish a game in a long time. This was a tough video to write. Hopefully the next one won't be so challenging.